My name is Charles Mayer. I'm the director of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second event in our speaker series this year. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Sandra Mitchell, who's a philosopher and historian of ideas, professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She's going to speak to us today on GMOs and policy in a complex, diverse world.
Thank you. So thank you, Charles, and thanks to the Rotman Institute for the invitation. It's an impressive institute, and I am happy to be here to speak about genetically modified organisms, which is what GMO stands for, in complex, diverse world. Now, my own work has been focused on scientific explanations of complex behaviors in a number of different systems. And in understanding the epistemological issues involved with explaining complexity, I was drawn also to the implications of the contemporary scientific understanding of complex systems for not just our conceptual issues about what nature is like, namely whether there's emergent properties and whether things can be reduced to explanations in terms of simple parts, and also methodological issues about how we come to detect the causal structure in complex, interactive, perhaps chaotic dynamic systems, but also in the implications of our understanding complexity for how we should act in the world. And what I'm going to talk about today is that third issue. How does the scientific understanding of complexity shape or should shape our understanding of policies around our actions that intervene in the complex world? So that's the kind of overall framework for what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to suggest today is that there are two domains in which uncertainty are invoked in trying to figure out what's a reasonable, sensible policy to have with regards to permitting or not permitting genetically modified organisms into our agricultural practices. And, All right. So let me just tell you in a minute what some of the facts about genetically modified organisms for those of you who haven't investigated this on your own. Now, humans have been manipulating natural plants and animals since domestication, usually by selective breeding. Read Darwin for more details. And hybrid crosses, and if you saw the ancestor of actually contemporary corn or maize, it's just a grass, right, that there's not much to eat, right, basically. And so, in fact, humans have manipulated the flora and fauna on our planet through artificial selection and hybrid crosses. But in the early 70s, science developed new techniques and new technologies by which we could intervene and change living organisms. And that was recombinant DNA analysis, which allows the introduction of new genes from a transgene, a gene from another organism, to be introduced into the target organism and thereby change the properties of that target organism. Okay, and so, that image didn't come out very well, but it sort of takes you through the steps by which you can isolate a gene. And most of the things we'll talk about use a bacterium, which takes up the new gene and can then go and implant it, so to speak, in the plant. I guess that's right. And then thereby grow plants like corn. In this case, we'll talk about corn, that exhibit properties, namely a protein, produce a protein that gene encodes for, that makes corn borers, which is a pest for the production of corn, makes them die. Right? I won't tell you the gory details of how it does that, but it's pretty grim for them. Okay. And currently, so genetically modified organisms, I'm sure most of you have run into the controversies about them. The question is, for us, how should policy deal with this new technology? And new technologies really raise interesting problems for both science and for our moral and ethical considerations of our policy issues. And those are the two domains where the complexities, needless to say, will arise. Currently, GMOs are found in more than 30,000 products, predominantly because if you read Michael Pollan, corn is everywhere, right? Okay, and then most of it occurs because we use so many corn byproducts. And that Canada, because I'm in Canada, I'm going to tell you, is the 4th largest producers of genetically modified organisms, following the U.S. and Brazil and, what's the third one? Argentina, I believe. Yeah, the United States, Argentina, Brazil, then Canada, followed by India and China. That was in 2006. China may have moved up the ladder since then. Okay, so it is the case that I'll tell you more data about it, but they're really taking over a large portion, especially of the corn production in the U.S. And so the question is, how should we regulate such new technology when it is being put into plants that live, that are grown in open regions, not enclosed areas, where they might interact with non-target species and with other, and where they might cross-pollinate with non-GMO crops of the same kind, and which we might then eat. Okay, so these are the issues. What's interesting is that this particular topic has raised a lot of controversy, and different countries treat it very differently. And there's a big difference between North America and Europe with respect to GMOs. GMOs are banned in 6 countries in Europe, most recently in Germany added to the ban. Okay, so GMO policy, I think, is affected by a lot of complex considerations. So you have to figure out, when you want to figure out whether or not, what kind of policy or regulatory policy to adopt, you want to assess what the consequences are of introducing GMOs into a particular agricultural environment. And you want to figure out what the, how to value those consequences. So there's environmental factors with respect to non-target organisms and biodiversity loss. There's health factors with respect to allergens. That was one of the earlier worries. And gene transfers. There's ethical factors about creating non-natural organisms, but also eliminating famine. Right? These are all considerations. And economic factors such having to do with crop yield and the cost of food, and also other economic factors having to do with how maybe monocultures or Monsanto, let's just say Monsanto, which is the biggest producer of these, how they are engineering more than just pest resistance, but other factors that are economically advantageous to them. Okay, so these are all kinds of issues when you're looking at this. So it's clearly a complex set of decisions to make, but I'm going to make you see it's even worse than that. So one of the things, and this is a quote from 1999, which got me interested in part in looking at these issues, that what is most, and this is a quote from a European Federation of Biotechnology study, they said, what is most worrying about the present, and I'd say in 1999, things haven't changed, they may have gotten worse, the present discourse is the near exclusion of an open scientific debate with clearly stated arguments. The arguments are highly emotional and fed by motives which are far removed from the actual issues on biotechnology. Diverse organizations use the debate for increasing their political influence without any useful result in the population. A democratic process functioning in an enlightened atmosphere seems a pipe dream. All right, so as a philosopher of science, of course, there are many complications that are political and economic complications for addressing this issue. But as a philosopher of science, and this will be one of the questions for you on the final slide, I think we have something to contribute to the discourse on these issues. And that is to see what kind of decision-making process best tracks the kinds of complexities that are involved in this particular type of policy decision. So that's what I'm going to try to lay out. So, okay, so it's a big issue. Okay, so sometimes it's pitted as a kind of stark dichotomy. And people who know me know that anytime I meet a dichotomy, I try to explode it. So this will be part of the strategy too, because mostly I think we have more than two options and things. But often this is posed as, should we ban GMOs, right, or regulate them? Now, regulate can obviously occupy a whole range of options, including complete laissez-faire, don't do anything, which is typically the U.S. response to these issues. Okay, but in 2002, the president of Zambia refused UN food program relief food that might be genetically modified. Okay, his population's dying and there's food and he won't take it, calling such food poison and saying it's intrinsically dangerous while his country is suffering from famine. In addition, in 2005, when he faced with further famine, Zambia decided to accept GMOs in their food aid. So there's a real issue about how we're to think about GMOs. They have real consequences for real people. Okay. Austria, Hungary, Venezuela, Luxembourg, Germany, a few other places absolutely ban them now. Okay. On the other side of that issue, whether they're poison or not, is the development of golden rice. And golden rice was developed in 1999 by, it must be on another slide, by I never get his name right, so I'm not going to try to, by a scientist, and what it does is it introduces into rice a protein keratin, which treats vitamin A deficiency. So typically, if you have a very limited variety diet that consists predominantly of rice, you don't get enough vitamin A. And that has been attributed to the lack of vitamin A in the diet, and these are in poor countries, typically in India and Africa. The lack of vitamin A can lead to what's called Nile blindness and can lead to famine, because of the nutrient-poor diet. So malnutrition. And it has been estimated by various simulations that having golden rice could save up to 40,000 lives a year just in India, right, by introducing that additional nutrient into their typically poor variety diet. So one question is, that's a form of genetically modified foods. Should we be against that? Is that has to be also considered in terms of the consequences for adopting that. Here it is. Potricus is his name. Ingo Potricus developed this technology, and it really is. It really has, since 1999, has not been able to be made available because of various regulatory procedures that they've now all gone through. And in 2012, I think it will be introduced finally into the market. Okay. So here's the two domains of complexity. Policy typically appeals, and I know this is a somewhat cartoon version. We can make it more sophisticated, but for these purposes, we really don't need to for now. Policy tends to appeal to two different domains: facts, what are the risks associated with GMOs, and values, what are the goals of introducing them, what are the consequences should we have them, right? And there's this kind of simple logic that if we know what we want, right, reduce famine, right, make crops able to grow in environments for which they otherwise wouldn't be able to grow in drought, make drought-resistant strains, etc. And we know what we get if we adopt different actions, the facts, then we should know what to do. And this is the typical predict and act or cost-benefit analysis that is used to guide most policy decisions in various more complicated forms, but that's the basic logic of it. And in fact, that's the kind of logic that's mandated in the United States. Since 1981, when the Reagan administration introduced an executive order that mandated that, quote, regulatory action shall not be undertaken unless the potential benefit to society for the regulation outweighs the potential costs to society, and the regulatory objectives shall be chosen to maximize the net benefit to society. And there's further, more recent elaborations that make it clear that this is just basic predict and act decision-making type of analysis. But now in the US government, you have to do it, whether you think it's the appropriate vehicle. All right. Now, so that's what that's the kind of simple logic, the predict and act logic. But I suggest there's complexities in both the domains of the facts. What are the consequences, right? And of the values. How are we to think about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to have genetically modified organisms in our agricultural practice? So let's look first at the value conflict, because and this is, I'm a little on shakier grounds here, but there are ethicists in the audience who I hope will sort us out. Should I step in a direction that's unwarranted? Okay. It seems to me that there is there's two kinds of complexity in our values. There's value conflict. We want different things, and we can't always get them both, right? And there's also value pluralism. What I want may not be what you want. And public policy has to address both those kinds of complexities. So we want to reduce malnutrition, I would assume, starvation, Nile blindness in existing populations. We have some moral obligation to existing populations. But we also want to preserve biodiversity for a sustainable environment for future generations. So if some of the consequences of introducing GMOs is to alleviate real harm in the contemporary populations, that's something we should want to do. If some of the consequences of GMOs is also to introduce consequences that may make the earth unsustainable, right? That should be something we don't want to do. Okay? And so we also might want to decrease the cost of food. That's another way of depending on what you think the problem is for famine in the world. That's one of the ways in which you might contribute to the alleviation of famine. And so with moral conflict, we're often in a situation, personally in our individual choices, where we can't get everything we want. We have to trade off different values. Can our multiple goals be ordered? How can we say what's most important? Can we choose things that help us achieve what is the more important value at a time? And that's one, so it's not just clear what value you slap on to the consequences of different actions here. Sometimes they're in conflict. I think more importantly and more in evidence of the kind of political debates about GMOs across the world has to do with value pluralism. And that's the fact that these different stakeholders, if you like, or different participants in the public discourse have taken very extreme and conflicting positions on genetically modified foods. So this is from the European Federation of Biotechnology Nuffield study, who studied the ethical issues here. And so these are two such views that can be expressed in terms of how we value these kinds of biotechnological interventions into nature. Nature and all that is natural is valuable and good in itself. All forms of biotechnology are unnatural in that they go against and interfere with nature, particularly the crossing of natural species boundaries. All forms of modern biotechnology are therefore intrinsically wrong. And you can find people who will say this. I mean, this is a kind of exemplar of that kind of position. That you shouldn't don't mess with Mother Nature. And in fact, Prince Charles is one of the ones who most vehemently says that's playing God. Playing God is another tack that goes with this sort of attitude towards how technology should be avoided in things that are not natural. On the other side, we might have the value. If we value the ethic of to each according to their need, then the introduction of GM crops on a large scale would be a moral imperative. It's not just it's a good idea. We better bloody well do it, right? More food for the hungry is a strong ethical counterweight to set against the concerns of the opponents of GM crops. So here we have people who believe deeply that they're doing what is morally correct, but they're completely in opposite ends of the genetically modified foods debate, whether we should embrace them, whether we should ban them. So how do we manage these kinds of things? And this is, I think, more difficult perhaps than managing the scientific complexity, certainly more difficult for somebody who's spent their time as a philosopher of science rather than a moral theorist. But I think that there are resources in ethics to help think about how to manage such moral pluralism in a community of stakeholders, all of whom are in some sense subject to and object of the public policies we make. All right. So, for example, Goodman and Thompson in 1990 wrote about deep moral differences, and they were referencing actually differences with respect to abortion, where the people on either side of that debate can agree with all of the facts, right, and yet still in the end have diametrically opposed views about what the morally correct thing to do. But how do you resolve conflicts at that deep a level if one needs to, right? And the argument is that, and here's their claim, mutual respect seems to be necessary to keep open the possibility of resolving on a moral basis any significant dispute about public policy that involves fundamental moral conflict. Now the question is there a fundamental moral conflict here? And so they suggest that at least you need mutual respect. Now that, given the current political climate, is actually even, I think, harder to suggest, but seeming to me to be a necessary requirement for engaging in what the initial quote I gave you said, that reasonable, rational discussion, open discussion on what we should do, has to at least include mutual respect for divergent views. In addition, but to have mutual respect doesn't mean that every viewpoint needs to be respected. Okay, every utterance, let's put it that way, needs to be respected. Some, and this is one of the roles I do think philosophers have to play, are incoherent or inconsistent. And so it's not that every stakeholder, I tend to side with the kind of procedural view of fairness and justice that Stuart Hampshire had developed in his work, to suggest that what you need in order to make reasonable policy is to have all stakeholders engage in a procedure that lets the views get aired and moves the discussion towards agreement. Okay, now there's ways to try to help that along, and mutual respect is one of it, but that doesn't mean every possible, logically possible, or even exhibited viewpoint gets to the table. Right? What has to be excluded are those that are not coherent, and I think crossing the species boundary is unnatural and thus immoral is inconsistent with everything we understand about biology. So it's not the case that, that having views that are so contrary to what our understanding is of the facts, moral views are based on misunderstandings of the nature of nature, and those can't be, I suggest, legitimate. But nevertheless, legitimate stakeholders should be involved in some decision-making around these issues. Now, there's lots of citizen councils and things that are involved to encourage people to participate in making these decisions, and I hope in the discussion we can reflect on what are the consequences of inviting much more public involvement in these kinds of policy decisions, and how particular political, perhaps ideological climates might affect that. But it doesn't seem to me that it may be true. Okay, so abortion was what Goodman and Thompson were talking about, whether genetically modified foods are unnatural and therefore intrinsically immoral is the other, versus they're just another technology they're not exactly the same as crossbreeding, but are they in that continuum rather than on the non-natural, intrinsically immoral continuum? And it may be that there are moral differences among people which cannot be negotiated in collective decision. I'd be surprised. There are things for which you cannot reach agreement. And these kind of bottom line differences cannot be resolved in the kinds of deliberative, democratic discourse that I would suggest are appropriate here. But are these the ones in genetically modified organisms? Are those kinds of bottom level differences? And I think they can't be. And one indication why I don't think they really represent them is that there doesn't seem to be, there's very little objection to the use of genetic engineering in the production of medicines and pharmaceuticals. Right? Almost none. So it's not that the biotechnology is intrinsically immoral. It's okay if it produces cures for leukemia and we can even use tobacco plants to be the biochemical factories for producing pharmaceuticals for rare diseases, for example. For those kinds of uses, the very same technology are usually people think are okay. So it can't be that they think that it's a kind of bottom level. That's my evidence anyway, that it's a bottom level. It's not a bottom line, unresolvable kind of moral stance. So I think there is hope for this being one of those topics that can be negotiated in a democratic, open forum. So how do you do it? Okay, and from this, I think that there are ways in these kinds of moral pluralism contexts, and here I'm adopting a framework, although enhancing it with this particular, applying to this particular case that David Wong developed in his article, Coping with Moral Conflict and Ambiguity. I can't read it on my slide. And what he suggested, and really what this is it's a form of mediation. It's mediation rather than here's a principle that will decide which is right and which is wrong. It's another form of procedure by which you mediate differences. And they have certain consequences for how we can come to some kind of agreement in this kind of situation. So you act in a way to minimize potential damage to one's broader relationship to others who have opposed positions. There, again, part of mutual respect is to understand that we're all engaged in a polity together for the long run. And not that any one issue and one decision is the only thing we're going to ever have to engage with. And that, I think, sets up already a context in which, if we can agree that the procedure is fair, we agree that it's fair even if in this one instance I may not get my preferred action, and in the next instance you may not get your preferred action, but we're both engaged in an ongoing long-term relationship. But there are other things one can do as well. You can select issues that minimize the opportunity for serious disagreement. And this, I think, is particularly relevant here. So in the case, if you want to decide policies, I think in a fairly specific rather than general way. It's not going to be ban all GMOs. Right? And in the next part of the talk, what I want to suggest is that in fact, the scientific and factual complexity suggests that we should have very local and specific policies because of the consequences attributed to genetically modifying technologies very radically with respect to any one of the 600 different forms of bacteria that one can introduce to the location, the type of host plant, the local agriculture. All of these factors play a big role in a very context-rich causal network that determines what, in fact, the factual consequences are. So just having a ban everything or promote everything are going to be the ones that are going to draw the most fire and be the almost impossible to reach any kind of negotiated agreement upon. So this implies that one should try to have more specific local targeted policies rather than these kinds of global ones. For example, you might want to say golden rice should be permitted, right? Okay, once you analyze the factual consequences and the values associated. But maybe Vasilis Thuringiensis potatoes, which I'm going to talk about, corn and cotton, might not be. Because in fact, the benefits you get in terms of pesticide reduction are pretty minimal. Okay, so, but the benefits you get from golden rice may be really worth engaging in that practice. Okay, and adopt a willingness to bridge differences and remove the us versus them attitude. And if anybody has any advice on how to do that, I'm all ears, right? Because that seems to be one of our big political problems. All right, so let's look at the other half of the equation, the kind of biological complexity on the factual level of what are the consequences of introducing this type of biotechnology. in our agricultural practices. So Vasilis Thuringiensis, this is one of the biggest, Monsanto is the biggest producer of this, and this is the biggest GMO out there. So we're going to talk about that. But it's a particular way, again, it introduces this DNA that produces a protein, right? But there are 600 different ones, and they all have different effects, okay? So it's not just there's one BT, okay? There's 600 different kinds of BT that are used in this technology. And their profiles are unique for each crop that they're introduced into, okay? So there's not just one introduction, and there's not just one context in which it's introduced. But so if you compare, let's take two, introducing this Bacillus Thuringiensis into corn, which is toxic to corn borers, which are the largest pest of corn, and corn is this enormous crop, okay, versus BT cotton. What are the consequences, factually, of introducing these? Well, for corn, it reduces the use of pesticide by about 5.3%, which isn't very much, right? Because the pesticides that are applied treat other kinds of pests that the BT doesn't target. Whereas in cotton, using this introduction reduces the use of applied pesticides by 23%. So already you see that even in terms of what the consequences are for pesticides, you're going to get widely varying consequences depending on the host crop that you're introducing the technology into. The effects on native species, other species, human health may be specific to corn, right? And as to cotton. And so again, the kind of local variance with respect to the consequences is something that needs to be taken into account if you want to take science into account to make legitimate and reasonable policy. The benefits vary by country and region, are heavily weighted towards cotton production, which has historically been one of the largest users of insecticides, etc. Okay. So should we ban BT GMOs, permit all BT GMOs? It strikes me again that this is a case where one size doesn't fit all, that the complexity of pluralism again contributes to wanting us to target more specific policies, again, which are going to let, I think, divergent stakeholders have a better opportunity to come to some negotiated agreement. So one of the things about complex systems, like the environment, or even our health, right, is that there are multiple causal contributions, there are multiple levels and scales in which they operate, they're interactive, sometimes chaotic dynamics, so even determining the consequences becomes itself problematic, right? It's, again, stepping outside the simple predict and act model is one that's going to be required to really engage with making reasonable choices in these kinds of domains of complexity. And these have consequences for how we model or represent the consequences of intervening in a complex system like the ecology, of generating reliable or agreed upon predictions of what we're going to get when we intervene in such a complex dynamic system, and consequences for using knowledge of them for rational policy. So now I want to turn to how do we manage this kind of complexity, the factual complexity. Needless to say, it's difficult to manage the moral complexity, but how do we manage the factual complexity in these kinds of circumstances? Okay, so where does the complexities of, and not all natural systems are this complex, but this one is, right? Now, the natural complexities introduce types of uncertainty that are not represented very well in the traditional cost-benefit analysis, in the traditional predict and act models of how to proceed to policy using science. And I have to say autobiographically that what got me interested in this subject is because, I'll make this a short anecdote since I don't have so much time, that when I was living in San Diego, which has the most, San Diego County has the most biodiversity of any part of the U.S. apart from Hawaii. They were introducing a new policy, a habitat protection policy that was supposed to be a model for all of the U.S. And I knew some of the scientists that were involved on the scientific panels, before they all quit after one meeting, that were supposed to be consulted with respect to how to create regions that were going to be preserved in corridors. Some corridors were like drain pipes under the freeways, by the way. You know, and you wanted to know, well, did the coyotes wait till all the rabbits got through before they went through that little corridor? Anyway, the problem is that the policy was set up in such a way that there were no surprises. It had a note, what was literally called the no surprise clause, which suggested that once you decided to set aside this parcel for a golf course, right, no matter what you learned the next week or the next year, you couldn't change it. Okay? And that kind of rigid policy vehicle is inappropriate for the kinds of complex systems that we're looking at and making policy for them. So what got me interested in it was in part because I was exploring the factual complexities of these systems, and I was seeing how the scientific understanding of those was not playing the appropriate role to play in our devising reasonable actions based on what we know. So that's what motivates what I'm going to say for the next 20 minutes. So let's think about the kinds of uncertainties involved with complex systems like ecology in this case, and intervening through GMOs or golf courses or whatever. Okay, so there are unknown consequences on known variables. Okay, that's one source of, we don't know, we know that there could be a health effect, we know there could be an interbreeding effect. These are variables we know about, but we don't know what the value is for those. We don't know what the cost is, right, or the benefit is. And there's cascading effects over long time periods. So as soon as you sort of move long scale in time, and this is really characteristic of global climate policy, right? Once you want to project 100 years from now, all of these become even less able to manage, to understand to get a good prediction, a reasonable prediction. Because you have cascading interactive effects over long periods of time, and you have the contributions of multiple causal factors, so you can't just track one, assuming the environment, the rest of the variables stay fixed, right? Everything's moving. Okay. So what's the problem is our current knowledge does not permit the assignment of any kind of quantitative risk based on the fact we know it could have an impact on health or on other non-target species, but we don't know what that impact is. So what's the solution to that? You might think, well, let's do more science. And that may help. That will certainly help. And there should be funds to do that. But there's this other domain of uncertainty which makes this a case of what is sometimes called deep uncertainty, namely that there are unknown unknowns. And this was language first developed by Norman Myers, unfortunately adopted by Dick Cheney, so it becomes harder to say it. But it was first introduced by Norman Myers to talk about the effects of global climate, that there are unknown unknowns. It's that there are chaotic interactions with unpredictable consequences. We need to study more on whether these are allergens, but we don't even know where to study until we've identified some of the factors that may be relevant to future consequences. So the problem is that no prediction in principle, if it's chaotic, right? No prediction in principle about what exactly will happen if we introduce GMOs into this field at this time for the next 10 years. So that suggests that this is a case not just of what's the risk associated with GMOs. Well, there's a 35% chance we'll have this and a 22% chance we'll have that. You cannot assign to those future consequences on which to feed into the predict and act model rational policy. Okay, so what do we... Well, we don't all go home and moan about it. There are, and I'm going to report to you, there are other models for both representing this kind of uncertainty and for managing, for policy vehicles to manage these kinds of uncertain situations. So it's not a question of when we have this kind of uncertainty, we should just say we don't know anything. And again, one of the issues for me, it's too easy for policymakers to say, you just pick up a newspaper for the last week and find this. The scientists don't agree. Therefore, they have no contribution to make to our policy. Dismiss science because there's not consensus in science. Or you can pretend there's not consensus of science, that also goes along, right? But that's based on this really rigid model that you have to be able to either know what's going to happen with certainty, right? Outcomes of policy options are fixed, values are assigned, maximize the value, or home free. Or you have to be able to assign risk, right, by consensus on those options. Quantitative probabilities of alternative options of policy options are assigned, values are assigned, maximize expectation value. So we have a vehicle for doing that. But what if you can't do those things, right? Now, some of the advice is do more science until you can do it. But there's a cost to waiting, and there are other do it. So the assumptions of prediction and their failures, if you like. The assumptions are we know the outcomes, right? And we can assign quantitative probabilities to alternative features. The fact is that not all variables have been measured, not all relevant variables have been identified, not all processes we examine today are linear. And so there isn't any way to satisfy the assumptions of prediction, the complexity and deep uncertainty predict and act fails as a reasonable tool for making what we know and what we value collaborate into making good decisions about policy. Okay, so so I've already said that. So I think I'll continue. In addition, how to value the desirability of alternative outcomes is also something for which it's not clear we have consensus. So these are all features of this kind of debate that make it look like we can't decide what to do. Okay. But can we do something? Is there something we can do other than throw our hands up in despair? And I would suggest that, here's the typical solutions. Ignore what we don't know or what we cannot get consensus on. That's a bad idea. That becomes politics, and no science are included except those that are by the dominant political parties. Right? Reduce the uncertainty, and that's not bad. There are costs to waiting. That's which we can get into if you like in discussion. Even getting increasing the number of parameters that you measure may actually increase the uncertainty of your projections rather than decrease it. So it's not even clear that that's always, at least particular versions of that are always going to solve this particular problem with generating policy components. Or what I would suggest, you manage uncertainty. And there are proposals for how to manage it, which takes into account what we know as well as what we don't know. Okay. Instead of pretending we know something we don't know, right? Or pretending since we don't know, we don't have to think about it. Those are to develop new models of representation in policy vehicles. So let me report to you some of those, which I think are promising. So Leonard, Popper, and Banks in particular developed this. Its name has evolved over their own work in it. But what we might call scenario analysis and robustness as a way of using new technologies, namely computational ones, to be able to manage great quantities of data that let us see, if you like, into a number of possible futures. Okay. So typically scenario analysis is usually best case, worst case, right? And is pitted against quantitative risk assessment. But best case and worst case are pretty thin as representatives of what could happen in the future, right? Okay. And so instead what they do is really expand on that and replace quantitative probability assignments to possible futures or single best estimates of probable futures with a diverse range of possible scenarios. Okay? And you can use what we do know. You can not represent the ones that we think are so low probability that they're not worth considering, right? And you can weight the ones that we think are more likely by their probabilities without knowing what exactly the agreed upon quantitative risk and number is. Okay. We replace optimization logic, maximize value, maximize expectation value, with robustness of policy outcomes. So now what you look at is the range of possible, a whole vast range of possible scenarios with the different policies attached, and see which of the policies are more robust, namely give you satisfactory outcomes in the most possible futures. Okay, notice this is a different way of analyzing what the policy consequences are in the future, right? And then what's really, I think, especially interesting to me about this vehicle is then you iterate. Namely, you do this, and we don't have time to look at particular examples of this in use, but you do this and you say, okay, well, this policy, don't ban golden rice, ban BT corn only in these set of circumstances, right? And permit it in those set of circumstances, right? Look at the consequences and find the policy that's the most robust, and then find out what breaks it. When will that most robust policy fail to be most robust? Which generates new policy options that are going to be better at all the possible futures that you're considering in this computationally elaborate way. Okay? And that gives you a way of doing a more iterative analysis that lets you develop policies as well while you're evaluating policies you're considering, because now you see where they break, right? And the other vehicle, so that's a way of representing our uncertainty in a way that lets us manage it rather than ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist, right? The other component to this is what kinds of policies we should have. And this is where work has been done on what's called adaptive management. Now, adaptive management has been part of natural resources policies for a long time. And what adaptive management is sometimes it's called learn by doing, right? Oh, this was where I was going to tell you the Habitat Conservation Program at San Diego County, but I already told you that story, so I won't tell it to you again. Anybody here see the TV show House? Okay, so House is an adaptive manager. What does House do? He has a case. He's a doctor, for those of you who don't know. He has a case. The patient's going to die in like a day. Okay? It's not, they don't have enough time to run all the tests to find out what the patient has. Right? So what does House does? He says, let's try this treatment. Okay? If it works, that's what he had. Okay? And if it didn't work, I learned that's what he didn't have. Okay? So in a way, what adaptive management lets you do is without waiting. Again, there's huge costs of waiting. You may never have enough information to have a correct diagnosis of what's happening in the ecology or what's happening in the patient before it's too late. Okay, now I know what killed off all the deer. Okay, well, there's no more deer, so I don't have to do anything, right? Okay, now I know what killed the patient. He's not there. So adaptive management lets you act prior to having the kinds of sufficient knowledge that these predict and act models require. And you learn by doing it. You learn that you test, you act, you test, you monitor, you evaluate, you revise. So here's a model of the kind of policy cycle that would take into account the fact that these are systems of which we're learning about more things as we engage with the system. This is the kind of procedure that would eliminate a no surprises clause from any kind of policy that we might adopt. Okay. There's a dynamic, iterative feedback from what we learn to what we do next, okay, without waiting until we satisfy some ideal of knowledge that I hope to have argued and convinced you of we're not going to get in these deep, uncertain, complex systems. Right? It's just not going to happen. So to pretend it's going to happen is to suggest science has nothing to contribute to policy. All right, so what's the conclusion? Oh, good. Deep uncertainty infects our understanding of possible futures involving complex systems, right? And I suggested why, right, in these kinds of systems. Old models of predict and act fail to help use knowledge we do have of them. And robust and adaptive models using multiple scenarios, iterative updates, and adaptive management are one way to face the challenge. It's a way of managing uncertainty and complexity with different ways of representing it and different policies that engage it without having to have either certainty or agreement on quantitative risks. So I suggest this means there's responsibility on all sides of this particular debate. Policymakers and citizens need to recognize the complexity of scientific issues and not be contented with something, an oversimplified version of what's going on that will be essentially misleading. So no more soundbite science. Risk communication must be enhanced. Policy has to be dynamically sensitive to the nature of knowledge acquisition for complex systems. Okay, so no surprises clause, and the ability to, needless to say, policymakers hate this, but of course they want to make a decision and be done. Right? And these kinds of systems don't make that a reasonable thing to do. And once and for all time policies, and you need to respect differences in values. That has to replace distrust. And notice some of these other things, oversimplifying, will create distrust, right? Because we all know that's not true when they tell us, oh, it's no problems here, right? Trust me, I'm your doctor, right? We all know not to trust them when they say that. But if, in fact, more of the complex reality is represented to us, then people, I think, will step up to the challenge of trying to negotiate reasonable policy. No more hype. So what I would suggest for us, I'm sure you'll have your own questions, but I think it's an important thing to think about is where can philosophy, since this is a philosophy audience, I presume, where can philosophy engage with the public discourse on genetically modified organisms? What expertise do philosophers have to bring to this discourse? And how might public participation, change the character of policy determinations should we create vehicles where the public can be engaged? So thank you very much. I welcome questions. Can you pick them so I don't have to keep track?
Sure. Let me just turn this on.
What is that? Technology abounds. Are those ethically appropriate?
Yep. Question? No.
Auditorily not appropriate. I can't hear you anymore.
It's a nonlinear system.
Thank you.
What number might is that?
Display of problems.
Okay.
Try to manage.
All right.
Sorry for that.
Okay.
Again,
We'll give it one more
Afraid
try.
to speak now. Yes.
So, I have two questions that are based on looking at GMOs by contrast with earlier debates about high-yield wheat crops that were introduced in the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
And I think the contrast is interesting because the way you set up the case about the value complexity side of the debate, it seems that the arguments you gave against one stand, namely that GMOs are wrong because biotechnology of that sort is immoral, if you disallow that as a legitimate standpoint, then it looks like in the values debate, you're essentially in the same debate as you were in with high-yield crops. You have worries about monocultures, different economic aspects of that, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be a new complexity in the value debate that's opened up by GMOs, except for the sort of false viewpoint that you argue shouldn't be allowed. And then on the other side, in terms of the scientific complexity, again, if you think of ecological systems in general as displaying a kind of deep uncertainty, then that uncertainty will arise in the case of introducing new types of crops, such as high-yield wheat, in the same way, perhaps, as they do, those uncertainties affect the introduction of GMO crops. So I guess the question is, how do you see the contrast between those two cases? Because it looks to me like a lot of your arguments are pushing towards seeing the debates as being really continuous with the debates about earlier introductions of
I think that's correct. I think, and part of it is that sometimes new technologies, and you can see, so the New York Times, I remember when they were looking at this intervention on growth hormones in salmon. So you could create salmon that just kept growing as opposed to the growth hormone cyclic being growing and not growing and growing. So it just grew really big fish really fast, which was commercially advantageous. Calling it Frankenfish, right? So it strikes me that part of what's going, I think there is a continuum. There may be differences, but there are particular differences, and part of what the argument is that we should look at much more specific differences rather than branding all genetic modifications with the same iron. That they vary, and that you need to look at the variation, but that introduce, and I think we would agree, and this is, I mean, I might be wrong about this obviously, but that we agree that that kind of genetic technology we embrace when it comes to creating medicines and pharmaceuticals. So there's nothing intrinsic in the technology that we should be objecting to, but only the consequences in particular cases of introducing it. And so in that case, it's similar to other kinds of interventions in ecology. And we historically as a species have been pretty terrible about that, And we might continue to be terrible, but at least this is a new technique for doing it, but I don't think it's sufficiently different morally that we should object to it too core. So I agree that it is similar.
So let me just follow up briefly this time. In terms of the uncertainty, so the argument about deep uncertainty, do you think there's specific further issues about uncertainties with GMOs? Or, I mean, the argument as you give it seems to be a quite general argument that ecological systems are complex, therefore we have this sort of deep uncertainty about any intervention we might do. I mean, is there some gradation there? Is it that certain types of interventions like GMOs are introduce different kinds of uncertainty?
Well, I think they do introduce different kinds of uncertainties in the sense that now you're doing a rather speeded up change in an organism that might not have been very accessible, if you think about possibility spaces here for a second, to that organism through natural, i.e. non-human, although we're too. Non-human, let's kind of call it natural, non-human processes, which are much slower in terms of the kinds of natural hybridization that occurs and the kinds of speciation events that occur, take a long time, okay? And most are failures, and now we can do a whole lot really fast, and most of them are also failures, but can find, if you like, something that is viable in a quicker time period. And so there is a question about the pace at which an introduction into a system that, like the ecological system, how the reactions to it, if you like, also have to happen right now as opposed to taking a longer period of time. So you do want to test for things like the allergens associated with introducing a new protein into a food product. Okay, so which presumably, I don't know how allergens are detected otherwise, but presumably that the pace may introduce the need to check for things that we do know could be wrong, could be new problems that weren't problems with the kinds of crossbreeding interventions that created the corn that is now so prevalent.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. I suppose when we are thinking about policy that enables policy to go forward with GMOs without full knowledge, as you're suggesting an adaptive management model might allow. I guess a concern that arises is if you're sort of making your best guesses at correct policy, you're still running the risk of allowing something to happen that could cause irreparable damage. And so when I'm thinking about this by analogy with house, he might suspect that the patient has, some bizarre tropical virus or something like this, and there's some treatment. If the patient actually has that virus, it could save their life, but it's also going to kill their kidneys or something like this. And if the patient turned out not to have that virus, then we just killed their kidneys for no reason. So I think that this is a potential problem with an adaptive management model, or any model in which you're acting without full knowledge, which of course we need to do. But how do you address that kind of concern, the concern of causing irreparable damage?
Well,
whether that be environmental or otherwise.
yeah. I mean, not acting also causes irreparable damage to the 40,000 lives, you might say, in India through maltreatment of malnutrition. So it's tough, right? But I don't think the solution, and I think we shouldn't be blinded by these past frameworks, that the solution is full knowledge. I think we act do you have full knowledge of every action before you take it in your own life? I think this is what we do. Right? So what should we do with regards to what we do? Well, we should be reflective and monitor what the consequences are as we're doing it, to see whether or not there's something we didn't anticipate and we can reverse. Now, when you mentioned irreversible harm, this is a different category, right? And for this, maybe it would have come up, but usually I get the precautionary principle introduced at this point in the discussion. Why don't we adopt a precautionary principle that shows that the burden of proof shifts from those who want to introduce a new technology, right, from those who regulate it to those who want to introduce it. So the burden of proof is supposed to be, you have to show that there won't be any irreparable harm before you introduce it, as opposed to you have to show that there will be in order to prevent it. And I think, again, that's a problem. I must say, I'm not a fan of the precautionary principle, which is just a form of an argument from ignorance, as far as I can see, because you don't know. Either way. And so just, again, maybe I'm being too literal here, but shifting a burden of proof, right, when you don't have complete knowledge, is shifting something nobody can get, right? Rather than addressing head-on how we can deal with with the kinds of uncertainty that are endemic in these kinds of situations. So I think if there's, if there's irreparable harm, right, then that suggests one should be more cautious, right? But it doesn't suggest that that by itself, I think, is a requirement for no intervention.
So a few people in the queue here.
Very good talk. I found this really interesting. And my question has to do with the first part of your talk and your value pluralism, which I thought was a really nice way to approach these questions. And right before you introduced the value pluralism, you talked about 4 different components, kinds of questions, ethical, policy, these kinds of things. And I noticed that one thing that you didn't have listed as a component, though I suspect it was in the background of some of the other ones you did list, was a legal component.
Yes.
And for me, I think that that's a really sort of worrying component for the value of pluralism, because what it does is, in effect, take away some of our choice as a public and our ability to participate in the decision-making procedure. So Monsanto, running the same bed, has invested a lot of time and money and lobbyists, and basically taking away our ability to effectively choose and have a say in these things. So I was wondering if you had any comments about that, or if there's a way in which or how you would respond to it, I guess.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think 2 things. One is that, for example, there's a big debate about whether or not GMOs should be labeled, right? Which seems to me a reasonable thing if we want to enhance individuals' freedom to act in ways that promote their own individual values without, damaging our collective will to provide the opportunity for. It's a luxury to choose not to eat something, frankly. But for those of us who have that luxury, that's a form of expressing our freedom to choose, to have the information to make an informed decision about that. And so that seems to me to attract that kind of moral issue about freedom and at the same time not preventing others from surviving. Because, they can't get the food they need. But I think what's interesting about the legal question also is that I think it helps clarify what the objections are really about. Okay, the objections aren't about creating new forms of food that could help relieve famine or make food healthier, right? But it's about who gets to control what these interventions are shaped like, right? And should we allow, say, profit motives to direct the kinds of interventions that are made? And notice that would be true whatever the intervention laws have. It's not specific to GMOs. And so targeting GMOs as the reason you object to them is in error when what you're objecting to is this kind of monopoly industry that is creating certain economic situations that are preventing, if you like, better distribution of food or intervening with indigenous cultural ways of producing food or all the other things you might think are significant. So the objection isn't GMOs, right? By looking at the problem more clearly and looking at the laws that you think are perhaps preventing free choice or something, if I've understood the question correctly, I think helps pick what you should be objecting to. What you should be objecting to are laws that don't give you information that you think you need to make decisions, and not laws about GMOs in particular.
Hi, thank you a lot, Sandy, for that great talk. I have to first say that I'm speaking as a PhD student in plant genetics.
Oh,
So,
correct all
yes.
mistakes.
So, I guess what I wanted to say was, first of all, clear up a few things that I feel that this discussion, and especially we see that with the problem of this golden rice project, which has been in the pipelines for more than a decade. The problem is really, especially in Europe, that is plagued with a lack of information. A recent poll, even in Western Europe, showed that 30 to 40% of Europeans don't know what a gene actually is. So that's a problem right there. And then a lot of times transgenics don't species boundary, like picking a gene from one species to another. I work with soybean, and we're trying to, for example, see the difference in variety, natural variety in soybeans between different types, different cultivars and such. So a lot of times we're just trying to induce or enhance a certain pathway that is already there. So that's one thing. And then with the fertilizer thing that you mentioned with BT corn, 5.3% of reduction in fertilizer, I think, is nothing to sniff at. But I think that's sizable. And when you talk about extrapolating stuff 10, 20 years, the same unknowns that you mentioned with transgenics also are there with fertilizers and pesticides. So if we extrapolate that impact on the environment, it's also there for our common practices currently. Now moving on to what I wanted to ask was, do you think that a policy vehicle should be deliberative, involving the public, given the lack of knowledge, or we should take some sort of policy management where it's similar to what we do for pharmaceutics, and perhaps have science and the government involved in this, appoint scientists and policymakers to sort of hash out stuff for individual crops, right? Because as you said, there's varying results for each one, and so possibly that would be the best solution.
Thank you. That was really a very helpful comment. And the question, in fact, that was in the back of my mind when I put that last question up. Although I didn't give you, there's a lot of survey results that show that the public is not very well informed about the science in these cases, right? And so given that, I mean, we all assume, want to increase deliberative democratic decision-making, because that seems to be itself a good, right? To get people to have have more control over policies that affect them, right? To represent these diversity of values, though not all views, right? But then what do you do in a context where there seems to be a couple of things? One, a real lack of trust. And one could look at the history of sociology in Europe and the differences. think mad cow disease was part of it, Chernobyl was part of it, where you got government and the perception of science as not being open enough to inform people about decisions they wanted to make about whether they should buy milk, because whether Chernobyl affected the production of milk, or with respect to whether they should eat beef because of the mad cow situation. So you created these things which increased distrust, which then made the availability of using scientific knowledge for the public much harder. Okay? So I think this is a really complicated issue. I don't have a simple answer to it. But given a context where people are again, what motivated me is I wanted to see science have a voice in policy, right? Since I believe, and I could give you arguments if you had time, that science is our best way of understanding nature, right? And therefore the results of science, though not perfect and certainly fallible and revisable, are what we should use to make reasonable decisions about how to act. And although I still believe that, and I was concerned it was being left out, there's this concern about people's values being left out, right? But what do you do when the people are expressing their values in a way that is scientifically uninformed? I think that creates a really serious problem. And you're suggesting that in cases where that perhaps experts and policymakers, governments, need to play a stronger role than public in general, introducing unwarranted views about the facts. So I would agree with
you. Sandy, it's not clear to me that the two methods of what we listed as perhaps novel methods of policy guidance are really all that different from the underlying logic of it. It's really all that different from what you call predictive act. So the first one, the scenario analysis one, that seems, I don't see that as being any different from what you call predictive act, where you just assume from the start that you lay down a uniform probability distribution on your probability space, on your possible outcome space.
No.
So what
Right.
what I'm going to ask you is to clarify why what I'm saying is wrong.
Okay.
So that's first of all, and then adding iterative procedure is something that a predictive act logic can certainly accommodate. And the second phase, the adaptive management. Well, you got to start somewhere when you first want whatever it is you try. Presumably, it's not going to be a random guess, and I don't see any real alternative to doing something like predictive act for the first choice of action. So, how is the underlying logic really different in each case?
Okay. Well, I think I have to say I disagree with every point you made. So let's go through them. It's not, in scenario analysis is generated when you can't assign a probability to every potential outcome. You can exclude some, right? So in a way, okay, so how do you treat them? Do you treat them as all equally probable? Right? You do the ones that you include in their analysis, although you could then run the analysis multiple times with varying assignments of probability to them. Okay, so you can, depending on how much computational time and energy you have, you could run a whole huge set of projected scenarios and test for robustness of policies, and thereby get away from any single assignment, right? And that was the point. And I could have quoted from policymakers about this lack of consensus on a single probability as the grounds for ignoring scientific contribution. So that was in response to that. You can use multiple probability assignments and run it multiple times and see if there are still robust policies against that background.
Does that really change the underlying logic, though? What you've
Well, I'm
done
not
as
sure what you're
simple
calling
logic-
it. It's certainly, as I've characterized it, does, which suggests you either have to know with certainty or have a single quantitative risk to chuck into the algorithm that generates maximized expectation value. So it's certainly an alternative to that. It's also an alternative to the best case, worst case, which has been an alternative scenarios, by saying that's not rich enough space in which to think about what how we should act reasonably, right? And in fact, in the last century when I took my decision, and you had decisions under uncertainty, and then you said, okay, well, are you risk averse or risk seeking? Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? And those were like the options, right? And those were cases where you couldn't take into account more than these very, very crude measures of how you felt about the future, right? And it strikes me these are improvements on them. At some level of description, you might convince me that they're similar because you are trying to predict something and you're trying to act on it, but it's certainly not in the way I've characterized it, which I think is legitimately characterized as predict and act. Okay, second issue was adaptive management. Well, no, that's not how policymakers, I mean, the habitat conservation measure in San Diego with the no surprises clause, it's still in effect, the no surprises clause, is one which is adamantly anti-adaptive management. Okay, so it's not the case that that's how we do policy anyway. That's exactly how we don't do policy. And unfortunately, again, as a philosopher, one has the license to say how it should be done without having to worry about how you actually get people to do it that way. It's very hard to get policymakers to be willing to engage in that kind of continually iterated evaluation and update. They want to make a policy and be done. And so politically, I think, and practically, these are not that easy to actually implement. Where they have been implemented, I think they've been pretty successful.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from the online audience.
Yes. So this is a question from Northern Michigan. They want to first thank you for the talk. And the group asks, do the same considerations about value pluralism and biological complexity apply in the same manner to ameliorating climate change or not? If so, what are the implications for policy on climate change? If not, why?
Thank you for the question, Northern Michigan. Actually, I think they do apply. In fact, many of to climate change. In fact, Lempert, Banks, and Popper have developed particular applications of scenario analysis and robustness for reducing CFGs and to test what the best policies might be for generating reduction of carbon emissions. And there, you have to add in the complexities of the economy too and the cost of things. So it is in fact that climate change, I think, is another good example of these kinds of difficult decision-making contexts of deep uncertainty. And so I do think it, in a way, maybe it's even, I'm not sure it's harder, but I think it's at least equally difficult to project consequences in climate for policies relative to climate change as it is to ecological consequences.
Is there a last question?
I also really enjoyed the talk. I'm glad you got the slide up. So I wanted to ask how you thought what the role of values would play in this picture. Because this all sort of seems like, well, this is what the sort of ecological managers will be doing. But is there sort of a way that values fits into this cycle, or do you see that as sort of outside the cycle? Because it seems like it's relevant. I mean, so I just sort of wanted to know if you had thoughts about where values would fit into that picture.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And things are obviously more complicated than one can present in this kind of time frame and lecture format. In fact, values come in lots of places in the assessment of outcomes. For example, and I'm just going to direct you to literature, even in determining the level of significance in type 1 and type 2 errors that you're going to take as evidence that this intervention was successful or failed to be successful implicates, if you like, the values that you're attaching to the consequences of those interventions. So values, well, to really engage with it, you have to start talking about what kinds of values. values occur everywhere, but kind of what I was trying to identify were more like the moral values that were being implicated in the GMO discourse, since they seem to be on the surface of that debate. Other kinds of values will occur in these kinds of scientific enterprises and policy enterprises. And so it is the case that, you know, if you really hate deer, right, okay, then you really don't care if they're being eliminated. Actually, you know, it's really the opposite in Pennsylvania, because their natural predators are gone, so they're really basically road hazards now, you know. So the question, you know, so those values will obviously come into these kinds of things as well.
Well, I'd like to invite you all to our next speaker on November 4th, when Catherine Brady is going to talk about unity, change, and what there is. But for now, I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers.